Alright, good afternoon guys. I figured I'd make a little bit of something different video today. Today I'm going to make a shock nerd video. Talk about all of the different shocks that I tried in my master, all the different linkages that I built, and all the things that I liked or disliked about the different shocks and what I've learned from it. So, based off of all of the shocks that you guys can see here, I've tried at this point 6 shocks inside of the master. You could technically call it 5 because there's 2 Pagode shocks down there, but yeah, there's been a couple different setups that I've tried, different springs. Those are all my springs. I've kind of given some of them away at some point and things like that, but here on the left, this is the original linkage, like the V1 linkage that was really terrible, that gave you maybe 20-25 millimeters of shock travel, bottomed out all the time. Also the main source of killing my Fox shock that's inside of this bag over here, because I was running at 350 psi and it kind of blew up. So yeah, this original linkage, nothing really good to say about it, other than yeah, it was something that was functional. This little modified plate was actually from Roger. The cutout lets you use the angled stem on the Fox shock. Now, actually, at the time that it was working, that Fox shock in the stock linkage I was actually really happy with it. It gave you really nice control of the rebound, really nice control of, you can see what the adjustments here. It's inside of a bag because it's hemorrhaging oil everywhere. But I mean, this gave you your suspension lockout. You could put like medium, hard, soft. It had the little red dial over there that gave you a lot of control over your rebound. Really nice shock. I liked it. Unfortunately, did not survive. Oh, I guess I should talk about the original Pagode linkages, or the original Pagode shock too. Yeah, this guy's actually, a lot of people really don't like him. I actually didn't find it too terrible. What it needed is either a volume spacer or you could fill it with more oil by, there's actually a screw right here. There's like a nut. You can actually fit like a 9 or 10 millimeter socket over it and take the whole thing out. And you can just pump more oil inside of it, and that reduced the air volume inside of it, and it gave you a lot more progression as you traveled through the shock, which helped a lot with bottoming out. Now, the biggest downside with the original Pagode shock was, well, there's a couple of them. Number one, leaking, okay? Well, actually, this is the shock that came out of my EX30. Yeah, leaked all the oil out, lost all sense of progressiveness. It was still holding air, but all the progressiveness was gone. Yeah. Also, no compression dampening, so you couldn't really even hide the fact that there was no progression by dialing up a little bit more compression dampening. Yeah, the original one, the one with the black dial, also had really, the granularity of the rebound dampening was really poor. The newer one has a lot more granularity. You have a lot more, this thing can turn a lot more different positions, but the actual usable number of positions is not much more than this one. So pretty similar story. They both leak, but yeah, it's okay. This is the spring shock that everybody usually goes with. It's like the cheapest, easiest drop-in spring coil shock that you could use. This one's the EXA 291R. This one you actually have to do some grinding on you could either grind the shock right here, or you could grind your suspension posts inside of the wheel itself in order to get this to mount. There's also a D&M DV22AR, which is pretty much identical to this, except you don't have to do any modifications. Now, the nice thing about this shock is, well, there's lack of maintenance. But in terms of performance, I find it very lacking. I also find the spring rates, especially with stock linkages or even the newer linkage, I'll cover that in a little bit. even the newer linkage, I find that it's like the springs are just too soft. Now, if you were just like a dedicated street rider and you were okay with like a really soft spring and you weren't doing really big drops, you could probably get away with using this sort of shock. Again, it doesn't have any compression dampening, so the only dial that you get is this little rebound guy here. Actually, at the time that I was using it, you can see that I have like a half size 1,800 pound spring on here, and I was still able to bottom it out with this spring, which is kind of crazy because that's 1,800 pounds. That is a lot. But yeah, no compression dampening. I think the overall travel here was like 35 millimeters of shock travel versus, yeah, whatever the ratio was. Anyways, despite this being so short, because I was on the original linkages over there and the original linkage didn't use a whole lot of shock travel, this was actually not the limiting factor, so yeah. Moving on to things that are a little bit more interesting. This is D&M RCP2S shock. It has a Cane Creek progressive spring on here with a 550 to 670. I was using this shock with this linkage. Now, this is one of my horrible looking DIY linkages that I cut out of just like sheet aluminum on a bandsaw. The ratio here is actually 35 millimeters of shock travel to 80 millimeters of suspension travel on the actual wheel. This combination was actually okay. I was pretty happy with it, but the main issue that I had was the way that you have to remember how the original shock fit on the master. It was like this, right? Kind of went like that if it was from the side. And during the compression stroke, basically if you brought it down too much, you can actually see this wear spot right here. This oil chamber would actually touch the tire. And that would obviously create like this terrible, it sounded like that my tire farted all the time. Although bottom outs weren't very frequent. But I mean, in terms of performance of the shock, I actually have no complaints about how this shock performed. It's very durable, had no leaks. The rebound worked really nicely. The compression dampening worked really nicely. And my favorite thing about this was that because of the way that the shock sat inside of the linkage, it was super easy to just access this compression knob. So if you were, let's say you were doing like you're on a trail, you're going uphill, and it's kind of just chattery and loose, you loosen this all the way up, and you had a lot of, your suspension would basically take out a lot of the bumps. In the road, it would be super comfortable, and then let's say you got to the top and you started going down, and you are flying down that hill, and it's like a lot of rocks, a lot of jumps and drops and stuff like that. All you would have to do, reach behind you, crank this down a little bit, and it would be a lot stiffer and no more bottom outs. Fantastic, I loved it. Now the downside is that I found at least with this particular setup, this 550 to 670, it's just not quite enough. I also wasn't really using the full stroke of the shock, so I wasn't really getting to the full 670 poundage of the spring. So the way that a progressive spring works basically is that as you compress the spring more, basically the spring rate increases. And because I wasn't using the full stroke of the spring, I wasn't getting that full progressiveness, and therefore it wasn't really, it wasn't as supple as I would like it to, I guess. And then the last shock that I have here, God, this video is getting really long, but this is a Cane Creek DB Coil IL. It's now in a second iteration of a scissor style linkage. It's kind of hard, it's a little bit to see in there, but it is a little bit dirty, but that's because I just got back from some trails and it's been absolutely fantastic. So the shock statistics are 200 millimeters eye to eye. It's a 57 millimeter travel, total travel length. But my master is actually a little bit modified. It's 100mm travel now, and the shock travel for this specific linkage here is actually 50mm. So it is a 2-to-1 ratio, and I currently really like this setup. Now the nice thing about this shock is that it is a 4-way adjustment. It has a, let me see if I can get this out of the way. It's really dirty, but that is this is a high-speed compression adjustment on the left. Then you have a low-speed compression on this dial. This screw right here. This is your lockout lever. And then you have a low-speed rebound, which is the silver dial here, and a high-speed rebound, which is this gold dial on the right. Now, the performance of the shock, absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of drawback in that you need to use this stupid little magnetic Allen key. The one that came with it actually fell out, but you need to use this Allen key in order to turn the dials here. So, doing adjustments on the field, a little bit less convenient, but generally I don't mess with it too much. And the performance on and off, doing, let's say, low-speed chatter versus huge drops, generally don't have to change it too much. It's been fantastic. I love this setup. But again, I do find this spring rate. This is a similar spring rate as this guy. It's a 550 to 670, except it's just a longer spring. So rather than being 45mm of travel, I think it's like 55 or 57, I don't quite remember. Labels on the other side, I can't really turn the spring because it's under preload right now. Oh yeah, there's also this linkage that I had. This is my first, I previously mentioned that this is the second style of scissor linkages that I built for this shock. That was to do the 100mm of travel and 50mm of shock travel. This guy that I have over here, which looks absolutely shreked and terrible and is otherwise in horrendous condition. It was actually also using the same shock, but it was an 80mm to a 53 stroke. And the ratio for that was probably more along the lines of like 1.5. So right now, I have 100mm to 50 travel on the shock. This was a 80 to 53-ish. So the ratio was close to 1.5 for this. The ratio that I currently run is 2. I found this to be very, very stiff and really difficult to compress. Now this was really nice for jumps. Like you would absolutely never bottom out, and you would never, you couldn't bottom it out for jumps or drops. So even like 2 feet drop, 3 feet drop, no problem. Like would never bottom it out. But the downside to that was that when you were doing like chattery stuff or just like cobblestone, that sort of thing, it was exhausting. Like the suspension was just so stiff that it wasn't, you would be tired getting to the top of the trail and you wouldn't be able to enjoy the jumps and drops on the way down. So that's why I ultimately decided that I wanted to retry the scissor linkage again, and I went to this setup. The other thing with this is that it was really difficult to set the sag. It's partially probably because the spring rate is too low, but basically I had to run a lot of preload in order to get an acceptable amount of sag. I think back when I was using this linkage, I was running like 30mm of sag, and you have to remember the original design, it was only 80mm of travel. So you run 30mm of sag, you only have 50mm of compression now. And I just found that so unbearable. I lost too much travel in it. So I ended up cranking more preload, and it made it more stiff and even less comfortable. But now with the current setup that I have, with 100mm of travel, I can run 20 or 25mm of sag, depending on how much gear I'm carrying, how much water I put in my backpack and stuff like that. but even with the 20-25 millimeters of sag that I run, I still have like 75 to 80 millimeters of compression available at all times. So yeah, in terms of things that I've learned from doing shocks like this, what I can say is that generally mountain bike shocks, like the poundage and the calculators that you generally would use, they are not useful. The main reason for that, I think, is that for electric unicycles at least, we are putting all of the weight on one shock, whereas on a mountain bike, you're dividing up your weight between forward and back shock. You have a front fork and you have a shock in the back, so the poundage tends to be cut in half, or at least I get the impression that's maybe what it is. Don't quote me on that. I'm not entirely sure. That's my speculation, but at my weight of 145 pounds, 140, with gear probably 150 to 155, the spring poundage that I should be using for a 2-to-1 ratio at least, it usually falls in the neighborhood of between 300 to 450 pounds. And yet somehow when I'm using it on my electric unicycle, the weight that I need, I'm finding that a 550 to 670 is still not quite enough. So be careful using the numbers off of a mountain bike spring rate calculator. The other thing in terms of just general compatibility with springs, especially coil shocks, not everybody makes the same inner diameter spring. They're not all compatible. Make sure that if you're going to try buying aftermarket springs, you need to make sure that the inner diameter is compatible. Also, you will, if you're going to try doing aftermarket linkages, a lot of times there are spacing issues in between here where your spring is. If you're going to use something weird like my Cane Creek inline shock, you'll notice that this arm is like totally shaped weird. It kind of comes, it's like coming out here, and then rather than just angling up, it kind of goes up and then it comes back out again, and that's because I had to do clearance for this. There's also really, really tight spacing right here. It's actually borderline rubbing right at that corner. So yeah, anybody that's doing your own linkage design, I mean, you probably know what you're getting into, but maybe you don't go with the DB Coil IL. If you did something like this DNM shock or a Devo Jade or something like that, that would have been a hell of a lot easier to work with than this guy was. Anyways, this video has gone on way too long. I appreciate anybody that's hung around this long and listened to me ramble about random shocks and show how much of a shock nerd I am. But yeah, if you guys have any questions or want my opinion on any of the shocks that I currently have, my thoughts on any of the other linkages and stuff like that, just post a comment and I'll get to you. Thanks. Bye-bye.